Clara Whitmore pressed her last handful of flour against her chest and prayed it would be enough to keep her alive one more week. Her fingers were bleeding from the cold. The stone walls of the abandoned mill groaned around her like a dying animal. Outside Willow Creek was waking up fires, lit bread-baking children, laughing a whole town full of people who had looked straight through her for 3 years and seen nothing worth saving. She was 27 years old. She had been invisible for most of them. If this story moves something in your heart, please subscribe to this channel and follow along all the way to the end, because Clara's story does not end in that cold mill, and you do not want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Willow Creek, Montana, winter of 1883, and meet the woman nobody wanted to know. Clara had not always lived in the abandoned mill at the edge of town. There was a time not so long ago when she had a roof that belonged to her, a small patch of land that answered to her name, and a mother who told her every single morning that the size of a woman's heart mattered more than the size of her body. Her mother, Ruth, had been a baker, not the kind who sold things from a fine shop with a painted sign over the door. The kind who baked because she understood that food was the only language some people trusted. When words failed, when grief sat too heavy to lift, Ruth. Whitmore would press her hands into dough and work it until something in the room softened. Clara had watched her mother do that her entire childhood. She had memorized every recipe in Ruth's handwritten book before she could properly read the words. And when Ruth died of fever in the spring of 1879, that recipe book was the only thing Clara carried with her when she left Missouri and pointed herself west toward Montana, toward the promise that frontier land asked fewer questions about a woman's past than settled towns did. She had believed that. For a while, she had believed a great many things. She believed hard work would open doors. She believed honesty would earn trust. She believed that if she kept her head down and her hands moving, the world would eventually meet her halfway. Willow Creek taught her differently. It was not a cruel town, in the way some frontier towns were cruel with open violence and lawlessness, and men who wore their meanness on the outside where you could at least see it coming. Willow Creek was cruel in the quieter, more suffocating way that small towns sometimes specialized in. It was cruel through omission, through the slight pause before a shopkeeper's eyes moved past her to the customer behind her, through the way women on the boardwalk stepped slightly to the right when she approached, making room for her body, in a way that also made perfectly clear she was not welcome to stop and talk. Through the job offers that never came, the landlords who had already rented the room when she knocked the church socials, where she sat at the end of the bench and nobody slid closer. Clara was a large woman. She had always been large. She had her father's broad bones and her grandmother's generous frame, and she had spent the first 20 years of her life learning not to apologize for the body God gave her, because her mother had been firm on that point. You do not owe anyone a smaller version of yourself. Ruth had told her more than once with a certainty that left no room for argument. But Ruth was not in Willow Creek, and Willow Creek had its own opinions about what a woman was supposed to look like. Within 6 months of her arrival, Clara had understood. The farm she had scraped together enough money to lease turned bad after a drought, and a landlord who decided the contract meant whatever was convenient for him. She fought it the only way she knew how, with letters with witnesses, with the stubborn refusal to leave a place she had paid for. She lost anyway. The landlord had a lawyer and a cousin on the town council, and Clara had neither. She lost the farm. She lost the money she'd put into it. She lost her borrowed mule and her seed stock and 3 months of labor. And the judge looked at her across the courtroom with the particular brand of boredom that men reserve for women. They have already decided don't matter. After that, she tried for work. She was strong. She was capable. She could cook, clean, mend, keep accounts, tend livestock, manage a garden, and do it all without being asked twice. She told this to every merchant, every household, every ranch foreman she could get a moment with. They all said no. Some of them were almost apologetic about it. Most of them weren't. She heard a woman in the dry goods store say it loud enough to be sure Clara caught it. Who's going to want someone like her in their home? She'd eat through the pantry in a week. The women around her laughed, not the sharp, mean laugh of people who know they're being cruel. The easy, comfortable laugh of people who don't think they're saying anything worth feeling bad about. Clara kept her back straight and walked out of the store and did not cry until she was 3 blocks away and behind the mill where the river noise was loud enough to cover the sound. She moved into the mill that same month. It was not a decision she made so much as a reality she accepted. She had no money for rent. She had no family to call on. She had a blanket, a cooking pot, her mother's recipe book, and enough pride left to refuse to beg. The mill was abandoned and drafty, and in winter the cold came through the walls like something alive and hunting. But it was shelter, and it was hers. In the only way anything had been hers in a long time, because nobody else wanted it. She learned to manage. She gathered what she could from the riverbanks and the woods on the edge of town. She traded small tasks, mending, washing, carrying for small amounts of food, moving through Willow Creek like a shadow present, but unseen, useful in the way a piece of furniture was useful. She kept the mill clean. She kept herself clean. She read her mother's recipe book by firelight and felt on the worst nights like she was sitting in Ruth's kitchen again, with the smell of sugar and cinnamon filling the air, and the sound of her mother humming something low and wordless. She let herself have that at least. She let herself have the recipes. On the morning that changed everything, Clara woke before dawn to find frost on the inside of the mill wall and her breath hanging white in the air in front of her face. She lay still for a long moment, taking stock of what she had. She did this every morning, a quiet inventory, practical and honest, because self-pity was a luxury she could not afford, and denial was dangerous. She had flour, a small amount enough to do something real with if she was careful. She had the wild berries she had dried back in autumn, packed tight in a cloth, and stored against exactly this kind of morning. She had a few pieces of hard sugar she'd traded for 2 weeks ago and rationed fiercely since. She had lard and salt and her mother's recipe for a crust that could hold together under almost any conditions. She sat up. She built the fire carefully using the driest wood she had set aside specifically for cooking. And then she did something she had not done since she left Missouri. She made a proper pie. Not a small thing. A real pie, the kind her mother made when someone in the neighborhood needed comforting, the kind with a lattice top and enough filling to smell like something from another world. She worked the dough until her hands ached and the warmth from the small fire had crept through her fingers and made them remember what it felt like to be doing something that mattered. She pressed the crust into the pan she'd kept from her farm days, layered the berries with the sugar and a pinch of the dried cinnamon she had been rationing like medicine, and covered it with strips of dough. She crossed over each other the way Ruth had shown her, tight and even and precise. She did not do it for money. She did not do it because she had a plan. She did it because she needed to remember what hope felt like, and this was the closest she could get to it. When it came out of the makeshift oven she'd built from stones and iron, it was perfect. She sat in front of it for a long time, just looking at it, breathing in the smell that filled the cold mill like something sacred. Then she wrapped it carefully in the cleanest cloth she had, and she picked it up and she walked into Willow Creek. She went to Henderson's General Store, which was the one place in town where the proprietor, old Dale Henderson, had never been outright rude to her. He was not warm. He was not kind exactly. But he was fair in a transactional way. He would trade with anyone who had something to trade, and he did not let his personal opinions interfere with his commerce, which put him ahead of most of Willow Creek in Clara's estimation. She set the pie on his counter. Henderson looked at it. He looked at her. He lifted the cloth and smelled it, and something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. "What do you want for it?" he asked. "A week's worth of staples," she said. "Flour, salt, lard, and whatever you think is fair after that." Henderson looked at the pie again. "Deal," he said. She took her supplies and walked back to the mill, and she told herself that was the end of it. A transaction, a practical solution, nothing more. She did not know that Dale Henderson, moved by something he couldn't quite explain, set that pie on the counter near the door where the morning customers could see it. She did not know that he cut it into slices and sold them for a nickel each, and that by 10 o'clock every slice was gone. She did not know that one of those slices was purchased by a man who had been riding since before sunrise, and who stopped in Willow Creek only because his horse needed water. She did not know any of it. She was back at the mill tending her fire and reading her mother's book, when Nathaniel Carter took the first bite of that berry pie and went completely, utterly still. Nathaniel Carter was not a man people expected to see shaken. He was 41 years old, built like the Montana landscape itself, broad and enduring, and not particularly interested in softness. He owned the largest ranch outside Willow Creek, 1,200 acres of the kind of land that made other men's ambitions feel small, and he ran it with a discipline that his ranch hands respected and occasionally feared. He was not harsh. He was not a man who raised his voice or made his power into a weapon. He simply expected things to be done right, and he could not understand people who did not share that expectation. He had loved one person in his life with the kind of love that rearranged a man's understanding of himself. Elizabeth Carter had been small and quick-minded, and perpetually amused by the world in a way Nathaniel found both baffling and absolutely necessary. She balanced him. She softened the places in him that had gone rigid from years of solitary responsibility. She baked on Sunday mornings with the kitchen door open, and the smell of it would reach him all the way out in the yard, and he would stop whatever he was doing and just stand there for a moment, hands at his sides, grateful in a way he had no words for. 2 years ago, a fever took her in 4 days. 4 days from the first sign to the last breath, and Nathaniel had sat beside her for every hour of it, and still found himself shocked when it ended. He did not understand how the world kept moving after that. He went through the motions of it, the ranch, the hands, the cattle, the endless mechanical demands of a working life, because the alternative was something he couldn't look at directly. He stopped going to town unless necessity demanded it. He stopped attending the social events Elizabeth had always pulled him toward. He stopped believing in some deep and practical part of himself that any of it was going to feel different than it did right now. Then he walked into Henderson's general store for a tin of boot oil and a box of nails, and Dale Henderson said, "Help yourself to a slice of pie, Mr. Carter, on the house." Nathaniel almost said no. He almost waved it off the way he waved off most things people offered him. Now the casseroles and the invitations and the cheerful attempts to draw him back into the world. He had become efficient at declining without being rude. He had it down to an art. But the smell reached him before he could form the words. Cinnamon. Wild berry. A crust with something in it he couldn't identify, some combination that created a particular warmth in the nose, a roundness that was not quite like anything from a commercial kitchen. It was the smell of something made by hand, by someone who knew what they were doing, by someone who had put something real into the making of it. He picked up the slice. He took one bite, and 27 months of grief cracked open without warning inside his chest. It was Elizabeth's pie. Not similar, not reminiscent, exact. The same balance of sweet and tart, the same weight of the crust, the same particular hint of cinnamon she'd always used just a fraction more of than any recipe called for, because she said it was the difference between food and memory. He had not tasted this combination in 27 months. He had not expected to taste it again in his life. His jaw tightened. His eyes went somewhere distant. Dale Henderson, watching from behind the counter, recognized the look of a man being ambushed by something he wasn't prepared for, and held his silence. After a long moment, Nathaniel set down the rest of the slice. "Who made this?" he asked. His voice was level, very level, the kind of level that required effort. Henderson shrugged. "A woman. Came in this morning, traded it for supplies." "What was her name?" "Didn't give one." "What did she look like?" Henderson scratched the back of his neck. "Large woman. Heavy set. Dressed poor. Didn't say much. Just put the pie down and took her goods and left." Nathaniel stood there. "Which direction did she go?" Henderson blinked. "Mr. Carter, I don't rightly—" "Which direction?" Nathaniel said again, still level. "Did she go—" Henderson pointed east. Nathaniel Carter left his boot oil and his nails on the counter and walked out of Henderson's general store and started knocking on doors. He started with the houses closest to the store. He was not a man who wasted motion, he thought about where someone who didn't say much and dressed poor might come from, and he built a logical grid in his mind, and he started at the most probable end and worked toward the least. He knocked on the door of the Miller house and asked if anyone there had made a berry pie that morning. Mrs. Miller looked at him like he'd asked her to explain the moon. He thanked her and moved on. He knocked on the Hartley door and the Beaumont door and the old widow Prescott's door, and he asked the same question at each one politely and precisely, and received variations on the same confused negative. Word moved faster than he did in a town the size of Willow Creek. By noon, people were watching from windows. By early afternoon, it was the only conversation happening anywhere. Nathaniel Carter, the richest man in the county, walking from house to house in the January cold, asking every woman in town if she'd made a pie. Women came to their doors before he could knock, amused and curious, and some of them hoping. Men on the street called out to each other and grinned the particular grin of people watching something they don't understand but find entertaining. Children trailed him at a distance, daring each other to get closer. Nathaniel ignored all of it. He knocked on the door of every household. He asked his question. He thanked them for their time and moved on. By mid-afternoon, he had covered every house on the main street. He had covered the houses on the side streets. He had knocked on the door of the laundry, the school teacher's residence, the home of the minister. He had asked 3 women at the seamstress's shop, and 2 more waiting outside the livery. He had not found his answer. He stood at the edge of town as the sun began its late descent, hands in his coat pockets, and thought. He thought about what Henderson had said. Dressed poor. Didn't say much. He thought about the pie, the kind of pie that required knowledge, the kind of knowledge that came from years of practice, from someone who cared, from someone who understood that the ratio of cinnamon to sugar was not an accident, but a decision. This was not a woman who had made a pie casually. This was a woman who had made a pie the way his wife had made pies, with intention and love and some private understanding of what the finished thing was supposed to mean. He looked across the edge of town toward the river, toward the abandoned mill that stood at the water's edge, dark and silent, and dismissed by everyone in Willow Creek as a ruin holding nothing but cold air and memories. He thought about the word poor. He thought about the words didn't say much, which sometimes described shyness and sometimes described invisibility, and he had lived long enough to know the difference. He started walking toward the mill. The wind had come up from the north by then, the kind of January wind that found gaps in coats and reminded a man that Montana in winter was serious about itself. Nathaniel walked into it without breaking his stride. He had worked this land for 20 years. He had ridden fence in worse than this, pulled calves in worse than this, sat by his wife's sickbed in conditions no weather could match for cold. The mill came into view against the pale winter sky. He had not looked at it closely in years, the way people stop looking closely at the things they've decided don't matter. Now he looked. The walls were stone, still solid despite the abandonment. The wooden door had warped in its frame, and one of the upper window frames had broken through, but the structure itself was standing real and enduring, and he noticed, in the way he noticed things about land and buildings, because it was his nature and his livelihood, that someone had repaired something on the door, a small repair. A piece of wood fitted into a crack, fitted carefully, the kind of repair you made when you intended to keep living somewhere. The kind of repair that meant someone was home. He reached the door. He raised his hand and knocked, and the sound of it was muffled by the wind and the distance and 3 years of a town pretending this place didn't exist. Inside he heard nothing for a long moment. Then a small, careful sound. Someone moving. The particular silence of a person who had learned to be very still when unexpected sounds came from outside. He said, not loudly through the door, "Ma'am, I apologize for the intrusion. I'm not here to cause trouble. I only want to ask one question, and then I'll leave you in peace. I give you my word on that." Silence. He waited. He was a patient man when patience was what the situation called for. The door opened. Not wide. A careful opening the width of a person deciding how much risk to take. And Nathaniel Carter looked at the woman who had made the pie. She was younger than he'd expected, somewhere in her mid to late 20s. Her face was round and pale from the cold, and marked with the particular expression of someone who had learned to keep their feelings well behind their eyes. Her dress was old and mended, and the mending was careful, done with the same attention to detail as the repair on the door. Her hair was pulled back simply. Her hands wrapped around the edge of the door were rough and reddened from cold water and work. Her eyes were brown and direct and watchful. She looked at him the way someone looks at a person when they can't yet decide whether the situation calls for fear or for whatever comes before fear. "Yes," she said, quiet, careful. Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and brought out the cloth-wrapped piece of pie he had carried since Henderson's store. He had not been able to finish it there. He had folded the cloth around it carefully, the way you handled something you weren't ready to let go of. He held it up. "Did you make this, ma'am?" The woman looked at the pie. He watched something move across her face, recognition, and under it something more complicated, something that had to do with being seen when you had spent years being invisible. Her chin came up slightly. "I did," she said. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her at what he could see of the inside of the mill. The single small fire. The thinness of the blanket near it. The cooking tools arranged with the careful orderliness of someone who did not have much but intended to take care of what they had. The book sitting beside the fire, handwritten old. He looked back at her. "My name is Nathaniel Carter," he said. "I own the Carter Ranch out on the North Road. I've been looking for you since this morning, ma'am. I've knocked on every door in Willow Creek." She said nothing, just watched him with those careful eyes. "I know that's not something a sane man would do in January," he went on, because he believed in being direct, and because he suspected this woman responded better to honesty than to anything else. "I know it probably sounds like I've lost my mind. Maybe I have a little, but I tasted that pie today, and I need you to understand something." He paused. He was not a man who spoke easily about this. He had not spoken about it to anyone in 2 years. "That pie tasted exactly like something my wife used to make. Elizabeth. She passed 2 years back. And I hadn't tasted anything like it since, and I didn't expect to. And then I walked into Henderson's store and—" He stopped. He looked down at the cloth-wrapped piece in his hand. "I had to know who made it," he said simply. "I had to find you. I don't know exactly why. I just know I had to." The woman in the doorway had gone very still. She was looking at him with an expression that was harder to read. Now something had shifted behind her eyes. Some guard had moved slightly from one position to another. "What do you want?" she asked. Not hostile, practical. "I want to offer you work," Nathaniel said. "My ranch house needs managing, cooking, keeping accounts, general organization. I need someone competent, and I have not found anyone competent in 2 years of looking. I pay fair wages and provide a proper room and 3 meals a day, and I don't ask for anything beyond honest work." She stared at him. "You don't know me," she said. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you made that pie," he said. "I know you made it here." He glanced past her at the mill with whatever you had available. "I know the crust is perfect and the filling is balanced and the cinnamon is exactly right, which means you know what you're doing and you care about doing it right. And I know that you've been living here, which means the town didn't give you what it should have, and I know what that kind of long winter looks like on a person." He met her eyes. "That's enough for me to make an offer. What you do with it is your decision." The wind pushed hard between them. She pulled the door a fraction wider. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "That's my name." "Clara," he said. She looked at him for another long moment, and he did not look away, and he did not add anything because he had said what there was to say, and he understood that the next move was hers. "I'll need to bring my things," she said. Nathaniel nodded once. "There's no hurry," he said. "I'll wait." She looked at him like she wasn't sure she'd heard him correctly. "You'll wait," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "In the cold." "I've been in the cold all day," he said. "A little longer won't hurt me." Something moved across her face. It was not quite a smile, but it was the shape a smile sometimes leaves behind when it passes through a person who has forgotten it was possible. She opened the door all the way. "Then you might as well come in," she said. "Fire's small, but it's there." He stepped inside. And the woman who had been invisible to every person in Willow Creek for 3 years looked at the most powerful man in the county, standing in her cold stone room and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the fire made its small brave sound between them, and outside, the wind continued its business against the walls of the old mill that everyone had decided held nothing worth knowing. They were both wrong this town. They had been wrong about a great many things, but they were most wrong about Clara Whitmore, and that particular mistake was about to cost them everything they thought they understood about who mattered in Willow Creek, Montana, and who did not. Clara had never slept in a real bed at the Carter Ranch. Not that first night. She sat on the edge of the mattress in the small room off the kitchen, a proper room with a door that latched, and a window with glass in it, and a quilt folded at the foot of the bed, and she did not lie down for a long time. She just sat there in the dark and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of a house that was still alive, the settling of wood, the distant movement of horses in the barn, wind against a roof that actually held. She had forgotten what it sounded like to be inside something solid. She pressed her hands flat against the quilt and told herself this was real. She was not entirely sure she believed it. In the morning she was up before the sun. Old habit at the mill, the cold woke her before dawn every single day without mercy or exception, and her body had learned to treat sleep as a thing you borrowed and paid back quickly. She moved through the unfamiliar kitchen, carefully opening cupboards without noise, taking inventory the way she always took inventory. What was here? What was missing? What could be done with what was available? The kitchen was well stocked, more than well stocked. She found staples she hadn't worked with in years. Good flour, proper lard, a full tin of cinnamon. She found a cast iron stove that had been cleaned recently enough to suggest someone cared about it, even if nobody was using it much. She found eggs and salt pork and coffee, and enough variety to suggest that whoever did the ordering knew quality when they saw it, even if nobody in this house was doing much real cooking. She built the fire in the stove, which drew cleanly and responded well, and she started breakfast. She did not think about it as a performance. She was not trying to prove anything. She was simply doing what she knew how to do in the first kitchen she had stood in, with enough materials to do it properly in longer than she could clearly remember, and the doing of it settled something in her chest that had been unsettled for 3 years. Nathaniel Carter came down the back stairs at 6:30. He stopped in the doorway. The smell of coffee had reached him first, she suspected. Then the biscuits. Then the eggs, and the salt pork, and the small pot of apple preserves she'd found at the back of the pantry, and opened because they were nearly past their date and would be wasted otherwise. He looked at the table. He looked at her. "You didn't have to start today," he said. "I meant what I said last night. There was no hurry." "There's always a hurry," Clara said without turning from the stove. "Food waits for no one, Mr. Carter." A pause. "Nathaniel," he said. She turned to look at him then. "Excuse me. My name is Nathaniel. Mr. Carter was my father, and he and I had a complicated enough relationship that I'd prefer not to be reminded of him at breakfast." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Nathaniel," she said, testing the weight of it. "That's it," he said. She set the biscuits on the table and turned back to the stove, and something in the set of her shoulders had shifted almost imperceptibly, like a door that has moved a single degree closer to open. He sat down and ate. He ate the way a man eats when he has been eating purely for fuel for a long time, and has forgotten that food can be something else, slowly at first, carefully, like he was trying to understand what was happening, and then, with more focus, more attention, his fork moving without pause. He did not say anything until the coffee. "These biscuits," he said. "My mother's recipe," Clara said. She was washing the prep bowl at the basin, her back to him. "She taught you well." "She did." Another pause. Nathaniel wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "Where is she now?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "Missouri," she said. "In the ground. Fever back in 79. "I'm sorry," he said. He meant it. It was in his voice, not the automatic social sympathy that people deployed like a reflex, but actual recognition, one person who knew what loss felt like, acknowledging it in another. Clara heard the difference. She almost said something about it. Instead, she said, "It was a long time ago." which was both true and not true, the way those things always were. Nathaniel finished his coffee and stood and thanked her, and went out to start his day. And Clara stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of him moving through the house, through the back door, out into the morning. And then she was alone, in a real kitchen, in a real house, for the first time in 3 years. And she sat down in the chair he'd been sitting in, and she covered her face with her hands, and she breathed, just breathed. That was the first morning. The days that followed had a shape to them that Clara recognized from a life she'd thought was gone. Work, real work, the kind that had purpose and direction and result. She had not understood until now how much of what had worn her down at the mill was not the cold or the hunger or even the loneliness, it was the purposelessness. The sense that her efforts disappeared into empty air. That she was working simply to surviving with nothing at the end of it but the next day's identical effort. Here things happened because she made them happen. The kitchen came alive. The house developed a rhythm. She found the household accounts in a drawer off the study and spent an afternoon going through them, and what she found made her jaw tighten, not from any wrongdoing, but from the pure, wasteful carelessness of a household that had no one watching it carefully. Supplies ordered at poor prices when better sources existed. Food purchased that went bad before it could be used. Small expenses that accumulated into significant ones because no one had been paying attention. She organized them. She made a list, and she set it on Nathaniel's desk without comment. The next morning, he came down looking like a man who had been doing math in his head since before sunrise. "You found all this in one afternoon?" he asked. "It wasn't hidden," Clara said. "It just needed someone to look at it." "How much do you figure we're overspending?" she told him. He put the paper down and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not surprise exactly, because she got the sense Nathaniel Carter did not surprise easily, but something adjacent to it, a recalibration, the quiet adjustment of a man updating his understanding of a situation. "I'll need you to handle the ordering going forward," he said, "if that's agreeable to you." "It's agreeable," she said, and that was that. But the ranch was not just a house and accounts, and Clara was not the only presence on the property who had opinions about her arrival. Nathaniel employed 6 ranch hands full-time and 2 more during calving season. Their names were Tom Briggs, who was the foreman and had been with Nathaniel for 11 years, and conducted himself with the particular authority of a man who has earned his position through sheer competence. Walt and Jesse Mercer brothers, who were nearly identical in appearance and completely opposite in temperament. Young Pete Calloway, who was 19 and tried very hard to seem older. And Ray Donovan and Sam Litch, who were quiet professionals who did their work without drama and expected the same from everyone around them. They received the news of Clara's presence at the ranch house with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Tom Briggs received it with no enthusiasm whatsoever. He came to the kitchen door on Clara's second morning, knocked once, and when she opened it, he looked at her with the flat assessment of a man taking measure of something he hadn't been consulted about. "You're the new housekeeper," he said. "That's right," Clara said. "Tom Briggs, foreman. Clara Whitmore. I know who you are. Nathaniel mentioned you." Something flickered in his expression at that. He was a lean man in his mid-40s, with the weathered stillness of someone who had spent decades outdoors deciding things quickly. He was not hostile exactly. He was watchful in the specific way of people who have been responsible for something they cared about for a long time and did not yet know whether this new element was going to make that thing better or worse. "You need anything from the barn or the hands, you come to me," he said. "Don't go around me." "I wouldn't dream of it," Clara said. He looked at her for another moment. "You want coffee?" she asked. He did not want coffee, or at least he had not intended to want coffee. But the smell of it was working on him the same way it worked on everyone who came within range of Clara's kitchen, which had very quickly become Clara's kitchen, in the way that kitchens respond to competence by belonging to whoever runs them best. He came in. He sat at the end of the long kitchen table and drank the coffee without saying anything for a while. Then, "Where'd you come from before here?" "Missouri, originally. Came to Montana 3 years back." "Where were you in town?" Clara looked at him levelly. "The mill," she said. "By the river." Tom Briggs went quiet in a different way then. She could see him revising something. "Nathaniel found you there," he said. It was not a question. "He did." Briggs looked at his coffee cup. "He's a stubborn man when he gets an idea in his head," he said, and it was not entirely clear from his tone whether this was a criticism or an observation or a form of respect. "So I've gathered," Clara said. Something shifted in Tom Briggs's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but a loosening. He left without saying anything more, but he left the coffee cup on the table instead of at the door, which Clara recognized as a small thing that was not a small thing. She washed it without comment and moved on with her morning. It was Pete Calloway who gave her the first real trouble. Not from malice. Pete Calloway was too young for calculated malice and too good-natured for sustained unkindness. He gave her trouble the way 19-year-olds give trouble, which was without fully realizing they were doing it, propelled by the particular social confidence of a young man who had learned that opinions delivered with enough volume substituted adequately for opinions delivered with enough thought. She heard him in the yard 3 days into her time at the ranch. She was not trying to hear him. The kitchen window was open because she was airing out after baking, and sound carried, and Pete Calloway was not trying to be quiet. "Don't see why the boss needs a housekeeper at all," he was saying to someone. She thought it was Walt Mercer by the responding laugh. "And why that one, did you see?" He said something else after that. Something she could not hear precisely, but understood the shape of perfectly well. Walt said something, and they both laughed. Clara set down the bowl she was holding. She picked it back up. She went back to what she was doing. This was not new. This was not something she had not experienced before. She had a method for it. She let it sit in the part of her mind that filed things under not worth responding to, and she went back to the work because the work was real and the laughter was just air. But then the kitchen door opened and Pete Calloway came in. Not knocking, moving with the casual ownership of someone who had been walking into this kitchen since before the current occupant arrived, and he stopped when he saw her at the stove and had the grace at least to look slightly caught. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat. "Pete," Clara said without turning around. She knew his name because she had made a point of learning everyone's name. "There's coffee on the stove. Help yourself and then let me know what you actually came in for." A pause. "Just the coffee," he said. "Then pour it and sit down or take it with you. I've got bread going and I need the room." He poured it. He stood. She could feel him looking at her back. Not meanly. Just the way young men look at things they can't quite place in the categories they have available. "You really lived in the old mill?" he asked. "I did." "For how long?" "About 2.5 years," Clara said. She turned to check the bread. She did not look at him. She did not need to see his reaction to anticipate it. "That's..." He stopped, started again. "That must have been rough." "It was cold," she said. "And quiet, I managed." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him reconfiguring something the way people did when the reality of a thing was different from the version they'd been carrying. "The pie you made," Pete said, and now his voice had shifted slightly less certain of itself. "The boss talked about it at supper last night. Said it was the best thing he'd tasted in years." Clara turned to look at him then. He was just a kid. She could see that clearly now up close, the unfinished face of someone who hadn't lived enough yet to know that the things he set out windows landed somewhere. "It's my mother's recipe," she said. "I'll make another one Sunday if you want to see what the talk's about." Pete blinked. He had not expected that. "Yeah," he said. Yeah, thank you, ma'am." "Clara," she said. "Clara," he repeated, and he took his coffee and went out, and he did not say anything else in the yard that she could hear from the kitchen, and by the following week, he was knocking before he came in and saying good morning when he passed her in the hall. Small things, not small things. It was the end of the first week when Nathaniel did something that stopped her cold. She was in the study working on the supply ledger when she heard him come in from the evening rounds. She heard the familiar pattern of it boots off at the back door coat hung in the hall. the brief pause that meant he was deciding between the desk in the study and the chair in the front room. She had already learned his patterns the way you learned the patterns of a house you were responsible for. She did not expect him to come to the study. But he did. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her at his desk and said, "You're still at it." "The February ordering needs to go out Monday," Clara said without looking up. "The current supplier for flour is charging 15% above what I can get from the mill in Bozeman if we order in volume. I'm calculating whether the freight makes it worth the switch." "And does it?" "Yes," she said. "By about $40 a year, which I know sounds like nothing until you apply it across every category where we're overpaying, and then it adds up to considerably more than nothing." Nathaniel came into the room and looked over her shoulder at the ledger. He smelled like cold air and horses, and something else, pine maybe, from the wood he'd been stacking she'd seen through the window earlier. He stood close enough that she was aware of it, the proximity without it being uncomfortable. He was simply looking at the numbers with the same serious attention he brought to everything, and she found to her own surprise that she did not mind it. "You're good at this," he said. "I had a farm once," Clara said. "Had to be." He straightened up. "What happened to it?" She told him. Not all of it. Not the full degrading progression of a woman alone trying to fight a legal system that had not been built with her in mind, but the essential facts. The drought. The landlord. The lawyer and the cousin on the council. The courtroom and the judge who had already decided before she opened her mouth. When she finished, Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. "You fought it," he said. "Legally." "For 8 months," she said. "And no one helped you?" It was not a question. "No," she said. "No one helped me." Nathaniel looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, something tightly controlled running below the surface. "Who was the landlord?" he asked. His voice had gone very quiet. Clara looked at him. "Why?" "Because I know everyone in this county, and I'd like to know who it was." She held his gaze for a moment. "It won't change anything," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I'd still like to know." She told him. He nodded once slowly and looked back at the ledger, and he said nothing more about it, and she did not ask what he was thinking. And they worked in silence for a while, him reading the numbers she'd organized, her finishing the calculations, and it was the most comfortable silence she had been inside in longer than she could remember. That was the night she started wondering if she had been wrong about what the future held. Not hoping. Not yet. But wondering. The twist came from a direction she hadn't anticipated the way the worst ones always did. On the 8th day, she went into the cellar to check the winter stores. This was purely practical. She needed to know what they had and what they'd need to supplement before spring, and she moved through it with her lamp and her inventory list going shelf by shelf, writing down what she found. At the back of the cellar, behind a row of preserved vegetables, she found a box. A wooden box not large, fitted with a simple latch. Not hidden exactly, but set back where you wouldn't find it unless you were being thorough. She hesitated. It wasn't hers. She had no business opening it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set down her lamp and her list and opened it. Inside was not what she expected. There were papers. Letters she saw at first, but under the letters a small notebook handwritten in a round, careful hand that was not Nathaniel's angular script. And under the notebook, pressed flat and slightly faded, a piece of paper that was a recipe. For pie. For berry pie with cinnamon with a crust built on a specific ratio she recognized immediately because it was the same ratio as her mother's recipe, and she had been working from that ratio her entire life. She picked up the recipe paper and looked at it for a long time. She opened the notebook. On the first page, in that same round, careful hand, Elizabeth Carter, her book. Clara sat down on the cellar floor with the box in her lap. Elizabeth Carter had been a baker, not incidentally, not casually. Elizabeth Carter had kept detailed notes on her recipe's variations. She'd tried adjustments. She'd made observations about what worked in Montana's altitude and what needed compensation. There were notes on timing, on heat, on the particular quality of the wild berries that grew near the creek. versus the cultivated ones from the store. There were small personal entries tucked between the recipes, not a diary exactly, but something adjacent, a record of what food meant to her, what she was trying to do with it, who she was making things for. On the fourth page, there was this: Nathaniel does not know how to receive kindness without being suspicious of it. He thinks everything good comes with a cost. I am teaching him slowly that some things are simply given. The pie helps. He can't argue with pie. Clara read it twice. She sat in the cellar for a long time. When she came back upstairs, she found Nathaniel at the kitchen table with coffee and the day's mail. And she stood in the doorway with the box in her hands, and she said, "I found this in the cellar. I opened it. I'm sorry I should have asked first." He looked at the box. The change in his face was immediate and not small. Something that had been contained and managed came loose briefly before he pulled it back. He set down his coffee with very careful deliberateness. "Where was it?" he asked. "Behind the last shelf on the left," Clara said. "I was doing the full inventory." He nodded. He did not reach for the box. "I know what's in it," he said. Clara set it on the table between them. She sat down across from him. She did not leave the room, which might have been the wrong choice, but something told her that leaving him alone with this right now was also the wrong choice. And she had learned to trust that kind of knowing. "Her pie recipe," Clara said carefully. "The one in there. I think it might be the same as yours," Nathaniel said. She went quiet. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I figured it out. I'm not sure how two different women in two different states end up with the same recipe. But I've been thinking about it since the first morning you made biscuits, and I tasted the same particular something that Elizabeth always had in her baking. There's a..." He stopped. "There's a quality to it, a warmth. Elizabeth used to say it wasn't about ingredients, it was about intention." Clara said nothing. "She was right about most things," Nathaniel said. "I told her that often enough that she started saying it back to me when I was wrong about something, which was frequently according to her." Clara felt something catch in her throat. "She sounds remarkable," she said. "She was," he said. "She was also stubborn and difficult to argue with, and she had opinions about things I had not expected a person to have opinions about." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "She would have liked you." The words landed soft and hard at the same time. Clara pressed her hands flat on the table. "I found her notes in that book," she said, "about wanting to open a bakery someday." Nathaniel was quiet. "She talked about it," he said finally. "Toward the end." He stopped. "I told her we'd have time for it later, that there was no hurry." He looked at the box. "There was a hurry. I just didn't know it." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that held things too heavy for words, and Clara sat inside it with him and did not try to fill it because she understood that some grief needed to be in the air for a while before it could be put down. "I'd like to use her recipe," Clara said when enough time had passed. "If that would be all right. I'd like to make the pie the way she would have made it here with what's available here. I think..." She stopped. She chose her next words carefully. "I think sometimes a thing started doesn't have to stop just because the person who started it is gone. I think sometimes someone else can carry it forward, if that's not wrong to say." Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze and did not apologize for what she'd said. "No," he said finally, "that's not wrong to say." He pushed back from the table and picked up his coffee and went to the window and stood there for a while, and Clara sat at the table with the box between her hands, and waited, because she had learned that Nathaniel Carter moved toward difficult things at his own pace, and the worst thing you could do was rush him. He spoke without turning around. "Elizabeth had a sister," he said. "Helen lives in Billings now. She came out here after Elizabeth passed to help close up the house and sort her things, and she and I had words about certain items." His voice was controlled, but not comfortable. "She felt she had a claim on Elizabeth's personal effects. including the recipes. I told her she didn't. She didn't agree. She left angry. Clara understood why he was telling her this. She might come back, Clara said. She might, Nathaniel said. Helen is the kind of woman who decides she's right and then waits for circumstances to prove it. She hasn't come back because she hasn't found a reason to yet. He turned from the window. You being here, he said, will be a reason. Clara looked at him steadily. I expect it will, she said. I wanted you to know, he said, before she appears, so you're not caught off guard. Something warm moved through Clara's chest. Not romance, not yet. Maybe not that at all, but something real and rare. The feeling of being warned instead of surprised, of being treated as someone whose readiness mattered. Thank you, she said. He nodded and picked up his mail and went to the study, and Clara sat at the table alone with Elizabeth Carter's box, and she opened the notebook again and read a few more pages, and what she found in those pages rearranged something in her understanding of why she was here. Elizabeth Carter had written 2 months before her death in that same round, careful hand. Sometimes I think this house has been waiting for something. Not a person exactly, but a particular kind of heart. The kind that doesn't break when things are hard, but gets quieter and more itself. I don't know who that will be, but I feel it coming. Clara closed the notebook. She sat for a long time. Outside, she could hear Nathaniel moving through the house. She could hear Tom Briggs' voice in the yard calling something to Pete. She could hear the horses. She could hear the ordinary sounds of a life that was not hers yet, but was becoming something she did not have a word for. She put her hand flat on the notebook cover. I hear you, she said quietly. To no one. To the room. To the particular kind of attention she had learned to pay to the moments that mattered. Then she stood up. She had bread to start for the morning. She had accounts to finish. She had a household to run for a man who did not yet know how much he needed running. After which was fine, because Clara Whitmore had been managing more with less for 3 years. And she was very good at starting from whatever was available and making something real out of it. She was just beginning to believe she might be very good at that here too. She put the box back in the cellar on the shelf where she'd found it, and she left the latch open. Not by accident. Helen Castor arrived on a Tuesday. Clara knew it was going to be a bad Tuesday the moment she heard the carriage coming up the road at a speed that suggested someone who expected to be received rather than someone who expected to wait. She was at the kitchen window when it pulled into the yard, and she watched a woman step down from it with the particular precision of someone who has rehearsed an entrance. Helen Castor was 53 years old and dressed like Billings money, which was not the same as Carter Ranch money, but was trying very hard to be. She was slim in the way women were slim when they considered it a moral achievement. She had Elizabeth's coloring without Elizabeth's warmth, or at least that was what Clara gathered from the notebook entries she'd read, and she was looking at the ranch house with an expression that Clara recognized immediately, the expression of someone returning to claim something. Clara dried her hands and went to the front door before Helen could knock. Helen looked at her. Clara looked at Helen. You must be the housekeeper, Helen said. Her eyes moved over Clara in a single practiced sweep, the kind of assessment that started at the top and ended somewhere around the middle and didn't bother going further. Clara Whitmore, Clara said. You must be Mrs. Castor. Nathaniel mentioned you might visit? Something tightened in Helen's expression at the word visit. I'm not visiting, Helen said. I'm checking on my late sister's home. Of course, Clara said, and stepped aside. Nathaniel's in the study. I'll let him know you're here. She did not wait for Helen to respond. She moved down the hall at a brisk and purposeful pace, knocked once on the study door. Opened it, said quietly, Helen Castor is in the front hall. Watched Nathaniel's jaw set in a way she had not seen before, and stepped back out. She went to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She was not going to listen. She was also not going to pretend the kitchen was soundproof when it clearly wasn't, and the front hall was only separated from the kitchen by one door and a 12-foot corridor, so what followed reached her whether she wanted it to or not. She heard Nathaniel come out of the study. She heard him say, "Helen." She heard Helen say, "Nathaniel. Who is that woman?" "Her name is Clara Whitmore. She manages the house." "Where did she come from?" "That's not your business." A pause. "It absolutely is my business when you've installed a stranger in Elizabeth's house." "It's my house, Helen." "It was Elizabeth's home." Another pause, harder this time. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "It was. And Elizabeth is gone. And I am the one still living in it." Clara turned the kettle handle so it sat more evenly on the burner and told herself she was not holding her breath. "Nathaniel." Helen's voice had shifted to something that was trying to be reasonable and not quite achieving it. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I'm concerned. You've been alone out here for 2 years, and now suddenly there's a woman I've never heard of running your household. And I think you can understand why that raises questions." "What kind of questions?" "The obvious kind." Nathaniel said nothing. "She's not—" Helen stopped, reconsidered, continued. "She doesn't seem like someone with the kind of experience required to manage a house of this size." "She manages it better than anyone I've hired in the past 2 years," Nathaniel said. "She's reorganized the accounts, corrected the supply ordering, and in 2 weeks has done more for this household than anyone has in the past 24 months. So I'm not sure what experience you think is missing." "That's not what I mean." "Then say what you mean." Silence. Clara poured the hot water into the teapot and let it steep and waited. "I mean," Helen said very carefully, "that Elizabeth had a certain standard for this house. A certain—" "Don't," Nathaniel said. His voice had dropped to something very quiet and very final. "Do not use Elizabeth to make this argument. She would not thank you for it." The silence after that was different. Clara picked up the tea tray and walked into the front hall. Both of them looked at her. She set the tray on the hall table and said pleasantly and without any particular emphasis, "I thought you might both want something warm. Montana. January doesn't improve with a cold house. I'll be in the kitchen if anyone needs me." She looked at Helen directly. "Mrs. Castor, I put you in the east room. It's the warmest one and it gets the morning light. If there's anything you need, please come and find me." Helen looked at her for a long moment. Clara held her gaze without blinking, without aggression, without apology. "Thank you," Helen said finally. The word cost her something. Clara could see it. "Of course," Clara said, and went back to the kitchen. She stood at the stove and breathed through her nose and thought that woman is going to be a problem. Not because she was cruel. Clara had dealt with cruel, and Helen Castor was not precisely cruel. She was something more complicated. She was a woman who had loved her sister and lost her, and had decided in the way that grieving people sometimes decided that protecting the memory of the person they'd lost meant controlling the spaces that person had occupied. She had taken one look at Clara and seen something that threatened her narrative of what this house was supposed to be. Clara understood it. She did not have to like it. The first 3 days of Helen's visit were a negotiation conducted entirely in the language of small things. Helen came to breakfast and rearranged the table settings without comment. Clara noticed and said nothing. Helen asked if there were any of Elizabeth's recipes available for the cook for Clara to follow. Clara said she was familiar with the recipes and had been using them as a foundation. Helen asked whether the weekly cleaning schedule followed Elizabeth's preferred rotation. Clara said she had developed her own rotation based on the house's specific needs. Helen's expression said everything her words did not. On the third morning, Helen came into the kitchen while Clara was baking. "I'd like to see the household accounts," Helen said. Clara turned from the stove. "Those are Nathaniel's accounts." "I'm aware. I'd like to see them." "Then you'll need to ask Nathaniel," Clara said. "They're not mine to share." Helen's eyes moved to the work table where Clara had flour and berries and sugar laid out. "What are you making?" "A pie," Clara said. "The recipe from Elizabeth's box." Helen went very still. "Elizabeth's recipe box," Helen said. "The notebook in the cellar," Clara said. "Nathaniel's aware I found it. He gave me permission to use the recipes." Helen's voice had gone thin. "He gave you permission?" "Yes." "Those are Elizabeth's personal recipes. They are—" She stopped. Her jaw worked. "They belong with her family." Clara set down her wooden spoon. She turned fully and looked at Helen Castor with the complete attention she deserved. "Mrs. Castor," she said, "I understand you loved your sister. I understand this house holds things that hurt. I am not your enemy here, and I am not trying to take anything that was Elizabeth's. I'm trying to keep this house running, and this man fed and sane, which is more than anyone else has managed to do in 2 years. And I am doing it with respect for who Elizabeth was and what she built here. I am not replacing her. Nobody could. I am just—" She stopped, chose carefully. "I am just trying to make sure the things she cared about don't get forgotten." Helen looked at her. Something moved in her eyes. It was not warmth. It was something older and more complicated than warmth. Something that had to get through several layers of pride before it could surface. "She would have made that exact argument," Helen said very quietly. "Which one? The one about things not getting forgotten?" Helen's voice had something in it now that had not been there before. "Elizabeth used to say that the worst thing that could happen to a person was not dying. It was being forgotten." Clara said nothing. Helen looked at the berries on the work table. "Wild ones?" she asked. "From the store she put up last autumn," Clara said. "I found them at the back of the pantry." Helen reached out and touched the edge of the cloth that held the berries. "She always picked them herself," Helen said. "Wouldn't let anyone else do it. Said you had to know which ones to leave for another year." "She was right about that," Clara said. "The ones that look perfect on the outside aren't always the ripest." Helen looked at her sharply. Clara met her eyes. And Helen Castor, for the first time since she'd stepped out of that carriage, did not look like a woman making an argument. She looked like a woman who missed her sister. "May I stay while you make it?" Helen asked. The question clearly cost her something. "Of course," Clara said. That afternoon changed things between them, not entirely and not permanently, but in the way that genuine moments of honesty always shift the ground between people, however slightly. Helen did not become an ally, but she stopped being an obstacle with intention behind it, and that was progress Clara counted. It was Nathaniel who brought the real trouble. On the 4th evening he came back from town later than usual, and with a look on his face that Clara had not seen before. She was clearing the supper dishes when she heard him come in, and the particular quality of his footstep on the back stairs made her turn before he'd said a word. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. "Sit down," she said. He did, which told her more than anything else could have about where he was. She poured coffee and set it in front of him, and sat across the table and waited. "Gerald Marsh," he said. The name landed in Clara's chest like a stone into still water. Gerald Marsh was the landlord who had taken her farm. "What about him?" she said. Her voice was very steady. "He's on the town council now," Nathaniel said. "Moved up from the county seat to Willow Creek 6 months ago. He bought the Delancey property, and he's been acquiring things, systematically." He looked at his coffee. "He's been acquiring things from people who don't have the resources to stop him." Clara held herself very still. "How many people?" she asked. "3 farms that I know of in the past year," Nathaniel said. "He buys the debt. Sometimes he creates the debt. And then he applies pressure in the way that men like that know how to apply it through the courts and through the council and through the particular kind of patience that people develop when they've done this enough times that they know how it ends." "How does it end?" Clara asked, though she already knew. "With him owning the property and the family gone," Nathaniel said. She looked at him. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because one of those properties borders mine," he said. "And because the family on it is the Hendersons. Dale Henderson's brother-in-law, James. He has 60 acres and a wife and 3 children, and Gerald Marsh holds a note against it that comes due in 6 weeks, and James Henderson does not have the money to cover it." Clara thought about Dale Henderson, who had sold her pie without knowing it would change anything, who had pointed Nathaniel east without hesitation. "And," she said. "And I can cover the note," Nathaniel said. I can pay it off and give James time to get on his feet. I've already offered. He's agreed." "Then what's the problem?" Nathaniel looked at her. "Gerald Marsh came to see me this afternoon. At the feed store. He was cordial. He made a point of mentioning that he remembered a woman named Whitmore who had some trouble with a farm a few years back. Made a point of mentioning that it was a shame how some people just weren't suited to certain kinds of work." He paused. He smiled while he said it. The blood in Clara's ears went very quiet. "He knows I'm here," she said. "He knows," Nathaniel said. "He came to warn you," she said, "about me." "He came to provoke me," Nathaniel said, "which is a different thing. He knows I'll push back against the Henderson situation, and he wanted to find a lever. He thought bringing up your history might give him one." Clara looked at the table. "Did it?" Silence. She looked up. Nathaniel was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face. Not anger, not pity. Something that was made of different materials than either of those. "No," he said. "What he told me about you made me angry on your behalf, not at you. There's a significant difference." Clara breathed. "He's going to make trouble," she said. "He's going to try," Nathaniel said. "Men like Gerald Marsh rely on people being alone when they come for them. They move on the isolated on the ones without backing." He straightened. He miscalculated this time. "Nathaniel, I'm not being reckless," he said. "I'm being practical. He's trying to do to the Hendersons what he did to you and to several others, and I have both the means and the standing to stop it. That's not heroics. That's just arithmetic." Clara looked at him for a long time. "You barely know me," she said. "You've known me 3 weeks." "I know enough," he said. "That's not Clara." He said her name in the same tone he used when he'd made a decision and wanted whoever he was talking to understand it was made. "I know what kind of person you are. I knew it when I walked into that mill and saw how you'd kept it. I knew it when I saw the accounts you'd organized in one afternoon that I hadn't managed to make sense of in 2 years. I know it now." He looked at her directly. "Some people take years to know. You weren't one of them." The kitchen was very quiet. She became aware that she was holding the edge of the table. "He'll come here," she said. "He'll make it about me to get at you." "Let him come," Nathaniel said. "I'm not Nathaniel. I'm not worth the fight he'll bring." The word landed wrong even as she said it, and she knew it, and she saw by the way his expression shifted that he knew it too. "Don't," he said, quietly and without anger. "I mean practically, I know what you meant," he said. "And I'm telling you not to. You have been told by this town for years that your worth was negotiable. It isn't. It was never negotiable. The people who decided otherwise were wrong, and I am not interested in reasoning from their conclusions." Clara felt something behind her eyes that she refused to let become anything more. She pressed her hands flat on the table. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Just don't leave." The simplicity of it caught her completely off guard. "Don't leave," she repeated. "If things get difficult, and they will because Gerald Marsh does not back down easily, I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing and stay." He looked at her steadily. "Can you do that?" She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. He nodded, once pushed back from the table, picked up his coffee, and went down the hall. Clara sat alone in the kitchen and thought about the word trust, about how long it had been since anyone had asked for it from her, and longer since she'd been in a position to give it without the ground shifting underneath her. She decided to give it anyway. That decision was tested sooner than she expected. 2 days later, Helen came to find her. Clara was in the yard helping Pete Calloway sort rope. He'd gotten 2 lengths tangled past the point of easy untangling, and had been at it for 20 minutes when Clara came by, looked at it for 30 seconds, and began working the primary knot from the underside, which was the only way to get at it. Pete had gone from mild embarrassment to genuine interest in about 4 minutes. Helen stopped at the yard fence. "Clara," she said. Something in her voice made Clara look up. "What is it?" Clara said. Helen's expression was the expression of someone carrying information they hadn't decided how to feel about. "A man came to the front door while you were out here," Helen said. "I answered it because Nathaniel is with Tom Briggs at the North Pasture." "What man?" "He said his name was Marsh," Helen said. "He was smooth, polished. He said he was an old acquaintance of Nathaniel's and he'd come to pay a social call." She paused. "He asked me how the new housekeeper was settling in. He said it with a particular smile that I did not like." Pete had gone very still beside Clara. "What did you say?" Clara asked. "I told him Nathaniel wasn't available and he could come back when an appointment had been made," Helen said. "And then I closed the door." Clara looked at her. "He looked at the house first," Helen said. "Before I closed the door. He looked at it like he was measuring something." "He was," Clara said. Helen came through the fence gate and stood in the yard. "Who is he?" Clara told her, briefly, factually, without embellishment. The farm, the note, the lawyer, and the cousin, the courtroom. The way it had ended. Helen listened without interrupting, which Clara was beginning to understand was not nothing for a woman like Helen Castor. When she finished, Helen said, "He took your farm." "He took my farm," Clara confirmed. "And now he's here." "Now he's here." Helen looked at the house. "Nathaniel knows. He told me 2 nights ago." Helen was quiet for a moment. When she looked back at Clara, something had happened in her expression. Some internal argument had concluded, some verdict had come in. "I'm not going back to Billings yet," Helen said. Clara blinked. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," Helen said with a flash of her original sharp manner. "I said I'm not going. There's a difference." She straightened her jacket. "Whatever this man is planning, he came while Nathaniel was gone on purpose. He's the kind who looks for gaps. Elizabeth would have—" She stopped. Elizabeth would not have left this house short-handed. Clara looked at this woman who had arrived a week ago ready to dismantle everything she'd built and felt something complicated and real. "Thank you," she said. Helen looked at her with an expression that was not quite softness, but was the closest thing to it that Clara suspected Helen Castor could produce on short notice. "Don't make it sentimental," Helen said. "Wouldn't dream of it," Clara said. Helen went back inside. Pete Calloway had been so quiet through all of this that Clara had almost forgotten him. She looked at him now. He was holding the untangled rope and wearing an expression she hadn't seen from him before. "Miss Clara," he said. "Yes, when that man comes back," Pete said carefully, "and I reckon he will. Is there anything you need me to do?" Clara looked at him for a moment. The 19-year-old who had laughed at something out a window 3 weeks ago, who had come inside for coffee and left differently than he'd arrived. "Go get Tom Briggs," she said. "Not now, but the next time that man appears anywhere near this property, don't confront him, don't say anything. Just go get Tom." Pete nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "And Pete," she said. He turned. "Thank you," she said. He touched his hat brim and went. And Clara stood alone in the yard and looked at the road that led toward Willow Creek, and thought about Gerald Marsh and his particular smile, and the way he'd looked at the house like he was measuring it. She knew what he was measuring. He was measuring whether there was anyone here strong enough to hold it. He had made that calculation wrong before. He had looked at a 24-year-old woman alone on a farm in a drought and decided she was not strong enough. He had looked at a series of struggling families over the past year and made the same calculation and been right every single time. He was going to make it here too, and this time he was going to find out what happened when the calculation was wrong. Clara went inside. She went to the study and sat at the desk and opened the household accounts. She pulled out the file she had built over the past 3 weeks, every number, every supplier, every piece of the Carter Ranch's financial picture that she had organized from the chaos she'd found when she arrived, and she started reading it again from the beginning. Not because she needed to, because she wanted to know it cold. Because when Gerald Marsh made his next move, and he would, it would be through numbers and documents and the particular machinery of financial pressure that he had used on her once, and thought he understood. He did not know that the woman who had been on the receiving end of that machinery had spent 3 years doing nothing but thinking about how it worked. He did not know what she had learned. He was going to find out. Nathaniel came in from the north pasture at dusk, and she heard him come down the hall to the study doorway, and she heard him stop when he saw her at his desk with the accounts spread out in front of her. "Helen told me about Marsh," he said. "I know," she said. She did not look up. "Sit down. I want to show you something." He sat in the chair across from the desk. "He's going to come at the Henderson note first," Clara said. "He'll try to complicate it, add fees, dispute the timeline, find something procedural that delays the payoff long enough to create a new default. That's how he works. I've seen it." She turned the ledger toward him. "But there's a second angle. He will look for weakness in this property. He's looking for debt for anything past due, for any document that isn't perfectly ordered. And you have," she put her finger on a line, "a survey dispute on the east boundary that was never resolved. It's been sitting open for 3 years. He will find it." Nathaniel leaned forward and looked at where she was pointing. "I know about that," he said. "It's minor." "It's a door," Clara said. "Minor is how he starts." Nathaniel looked at her. "How do you know this?" he asked. "Because he did it to me," she said. "I had a minor survey question on my lease. He turned it into 4 months of legal delay and used the delay to reclassify me as in breach. Minor is always how he starts." She held his gaze. "We need to close that survey dispute before he finds it. And we need to get the Henderson note paid and documented perfectly, not just paid." Nathaniel was quiet. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. "You've been sitting here doing this since this afternoon," he said. "Yes." "Clara?" "Someone had to," she said. The quiet that followed was different from the quiet they usually sat in. It had a weight to it, a particular fullness. "This is my fight," he said. "You don't have to." "He took my farm," Clara said, and her voice did not shake at all. "He took 3 years of my life and everything I'd built, and he walked away believing I was someone small enough to do that to, without consequence. He is now standing at the edge of your life and pointing at me and smiling, and I will not—" She stopped, breathed, continued quieter. "I will not sit in a kitchen and wait to see what happens. I am not built that way, and I think you know it." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "I know it," he said. "Then let me help," she said. He put his hand on the edge of the desk. Not on her hand. On the wood beside it, close enough that she was aware of it. "All right," he said. Outside, the wind was doing its January business against the walls of the house. Inside, the fire was going in the study hearth, and the lamp was lit, and the accounts were spread between them, and Clara Whitmore was planning the dismantling of a man who had once believed she was too small to matter. He had been wrong then. He was about to discover how wrong he had been. The survey dispute took 4 days to close. Nathaniel rode to the county land office in person on the first morning with the original boundary documents Clara had found, folded inside the accounts file documents he had not known existed because they'd been misfiled 3 years ago by the previous housekeeper, and no one had gone looking. Clara had found them on her second full pass through the study tucked inside a ledger from 1879 that had no business being where it was. She had said nothing about finding them until the night Gerald Marsh stood at the edge of the property and smiled. Nathaniel had looked at her when she'd pulled them out of the file. "You found these last week," he said. It was not a question. "I found them the second day," she said. "I didn't know they mattered until I understood what Marsh was looking for." He had looked at her for a long moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the look of a man updating his understanding of a situation again, and finding that the update was larger than the one before it. He took the documents to the land office and came back with a resolution stamp and a closed notation that cost him $40 in administrative fees and was worth considerably more than that. When he walked back into the kitchen and set the stamped papers on the table, Clara looked at them and then looked at him and felt something ease in her chest that had been wound tight for 4 days. "One door closed," she said. "One door closed," he agreed. He sat down. She put coffee in front of him without being asked, because she'd had a pot ready for the past 2 hours. The Henderson note is next. I'm meeting with James Henderson tomorrow morning, and I want the paperwork clean. Every line, every signature, every date. I want it done in front of witnesses. Dale Henderson should be one of them, Clara said. If Gerald Marsh tries to contest it later, having Dale as witness makes it harder. He's known in this town in a way that doesn't give Marsh room to work with. Nathaniel looked at her. You think like a lawyer, he said. I think like someone who lost to one, she said. The Henderson meeting happened the next morning at Dale Henderson's store, which was Clara's suggestion for the same reason Dale's presence was her suggestion. It was public. It was witnessed by anyone who happened to come in for goods, and it meant Gerald Marsh could not later construct a narrative of private pressure or coercion. Nathaniel signed the note payoff in front of Dale James Henderson Tom Briggs, and the Methodist minister who happened to be buying flour, and was asked to stay by a nod from Nathaniel that the minister, a perceptive man, understood immediately. Clara was not there. She had suggested the location and the witnesses and the minister, and then she had stayed at the ranch and made bread and thought hard about what Marsh would do next. She was good at that, the thinking. She had always been good at it. At the farm in Missouri before Montana, she had been the one who kept the books and planned the seasonal orders and calculated the margins when other people were still deciding what to plant. Her mother had taught her to read numbers the way some mothers taught their daughters to read music as a language that had its own rhythms and its own beauty and its own particular way of telling you the truth when everything else was lying. She had not expected that skill to matter after she lost the farm. There had been a period not long, but real, when she thought she had brought the loss on herself by not being clever enough, not knowing enough, not fighting well enough. 3 years in the mill had mostly cured her of that particular poison. She had not lost the farm because she was not clever enough. She had lost it because Gerald Marsh had more resources and more allies and more experience at winning, and she had been alone. She was not alone now. That thought was still new enough that she had to examine it carefully each time it surfaced, the way you tested ice before putting your full weight on it. Nathaniel came back from Henderson's store in the early afternoon, wearing the expression of a man who had completed a difficult task cleanly and was allowing himself a single moment of satisfaction before moving to the next one. Done, he said. Any sign of Marsh? She asked. No, he said. Which means he heard about it and decided not to show. He hung his coat. He'll move differently now. He knows the Henderson angle is closed and the survey dispute is closed. He'll look for something else. He'll look at me, Clara said. Nathaniel turned. He's already decided I'm a leaver, she said. He came here and asked about me specifically. He'll try to find something in my past that he can use to make you question bringing me here. Some document, some court record, some way to make me look like a liability instead of an asset. She held his gaze. There's a judgment against me from the farm case, a civil judgment. He'll find it if he hasn't already. It makes me look like I defaulted on a contract. Did you? No, she said. The judgment was wrong, but wrong judgments get recorded the same as right ones, and on paper it looks like I walked away from a legal obligation. Nathaniel sat down at the table. Tell me everything, he said. All of it. Every document, every date, every name. She told him. All of it, this time the full version she had given no one, because there had been no one to give it to. The lease and the drought, and the landlord's first maneuver, which had been subtle enough that she'd almost missed it. The way he'd reclassified the survey question as a breach trigger. The lawyer she couldn't afford, countered by the lawyer Marsh had on retainer. The judge who had looked at the paperwork and seen a woman alone against a man with allies and made the calculation that most people in his position made. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. He did not make sounds of sympathy or outrage. He simply listened the way he listened to everything, with the focused stillness of a man who understood that interrupting a person telling you something important was its own kind of disrespect. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The original lease, he said. Do you have it? I kept a copy, she said. It's in the mill. He looked at her. In the mill, he repeated. I left some things there, she said. I didn't know if I wasn't sure this was permanent. She paused. I kept the things I couldn't replace. He stood up. We need to go get them, he said. Nathaniel, we need to go get them today, he said. Before Marsh thinks to look there. Clara stared at him. The mill had been her private wreckage, the place where she had compressed herself down to the smallest version of survival available. She had not gone back since the night he'd walked through that door and changed everything, and the idea of going back now with him beside her was something she had not prepared herself for. All right, she said. The ride into town was quiet. Not uncomfortable, they had developed a comfortable silence over the past weeks, the kind that people develop when they've been working in close proximity toward a shared purpose, but waited today with something additional. Clara kept her eyes on the road and thought about the mill, and tried to arrange her feelings about it into something manageable. When they reached it, she got down from the buggy without waiting for help. Old habit. She unlatched the door and went inside, and Nathaniel followed, and for a moment the contrast between then and now was so complete that she had to stand still and let it move through her. The fire was out. Of course it was out. The blanket was still near where the fire had been. The cooking pot was still in its place. The small, careful order she had maintained was still there because that was who she was, and the mill had not changed it. She went to the back wall where she had hidden the tin box, not hidden exactly, but placed behind a loose stone in a way that required knowing where to look, and she took out the tin and opened it. The original lease was there, her copy of the court filing, 2 letters from the county clerk confirming dates that contradicted what Marsh's lawyer had argued. And at the bottom, folded separately, a letter from a witness who had seen the landlord on her property before the breach notice was filed, a witness who had moved to Denver the following year, and whom Clara had been unable to reach in time for the original proceedings. She handed Nathaniel the tin. He went through it carefully. She watched his face while he read. When he got to the witness letter, he stopped. This man, he said. Do you know where he is now? Denver, she said. Last I knew. His name is Robert Calloway, Nathaniel said. Something registered. Pete's father is named Robert, Clara said slowly. Nathaniel looked up. Pete Calloway, Clara said. He told me his father left Montana 4 years ago, went to Denver for work. She felt something cold and electric run through her. Pete's last name is Calloway. The silence between them had the quality of something about to change. I'll talk to Pete, Nathaniel said. He did it that afternoon. Clara was in the kitchen making absolutely no pretense of not being aware of what was happening when Nathaniel found Pete in the barn and came back 20 minutes later. He came to the kitchen doorway. Pete's father is in Denver, he said. Pete is going to write to him today and ask if he's willing to come back or to send a signed affidavit about what he saw on that property. Clara set down what she was holding. Pete doesn't know what this is about, Nathaniel continued. He doesn't need to. He just knows his father might be able to help. Nathaniel, she said. It might take weeks, he said. The mail is slow. Denver is not close. Marsh might move before we have it. I know. But if we get it, I know what it means, she said. She pressed her hands flat on the counter and breathed through it, the enormity of it, the too muchness of being helped, of watching a string of people and moments arrange themselves around her in a way that was so foreign to her experience of the world that she kept waiting for the part where it fell apart. Why, she said. Why what? Why all of this, she said. The survey, the Hendersons, the letter. You didn't sign on for any of this when you offered me work. Nathaniel came into the kitchen. He stood on the other side of the table from her. No, he said. I signed on because I tasted a pie in a general store and couldn't explain why it mattered as much as it did. He looked at her steadily. But that's not what this is anymore. She held very still. What is it? She asked. It's what's right, he said. Marsh took something from you that he had no right to take, and he used the law to do it, and he is now standing at the edge of this property, believing that he can use your past to weaken you. He believed that about you once before, and it worked. I'm not willing to let it work again." "That is not—" She stopped, gathered herself. "You cannot undo what happened to me 3 years ago." "No," he said, "but I can change what happens now." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him. He looked at her, and whatever had been building between them for 4 weeks, the careful distance they had both been maintaining, the deliberate professionalism, the tacit agreement that the line between employer and something else was a line worth keeping, shifted. Not dramatically. Not with any of the language she'd have expected, no sweeping declaration, no sudden closing of distance. Just a shift in the air, a change in the quality of the silence, both of them aware of it, and neither of them moving yet. "I'll be in the study," he said. "If you want to go through those documents tonight, I'd like the help." "I'll be there after supper," she said. He nodded and went down the hall. Clara stood alone in the kitchen and thought about the word change. The trouble arrived the following morning in the form of a formal letter delivered by a writer who asked for Nathaniel Carter by name and left without waiting for a response. Nathaniel read it at the breakfast table. Clara watched his face go through several things in quick succession: recognition, then a kind of cold clarity, then something that was not quite anger, but was anger's more dangerous cousin. He passed it to her without a word. It was from Gerald Marsh's lawyer in Billings. It alleged that Nathaniel Carter had engaged in the fraudulent transfer of a financial instrument, the Henderson note payoff, with the intent to interfere with a legitimate commercial interest. It requested that all documents relating to the transfer be made available for review. It noted in a final paragraph that was clearly the point of the entire letter that questions had arisen regarding the background of persons currently employed on the Carter Ranch property, and that the association between Mr. Carter and a named individual with a civil judgment on record might be of interest to the banking institutions with whom Mr. Carter maintained business relationships. Clara set the letter down. Her name was in the final paragraph, spelled correctly with the judgment date and the county of record precise and documented and weaponized exactly the way she'd told Nathaniel it would be. "He's faster than I expected," she said. Her voice was absolutely flat. "He had it ready," Nathaniel said. "He's been planning this since before he came to the property. He was waiting for a reason to send it." He picked up his coffee. The Henderson payoff gave him his reason. "He's going to your bank," Clara said. "He's going to try," Nathaniel said. "Nathaniel, your banking relationship is not something that can be—" "My banking relationship," Nathaniel said carefully, "is with Edward Pruitt at First Territorial, who has known me for 16 years and who owes me a conversation before he does anything based on a letter from a lawyer he's never met." He stood. "I'm going to town." "I'm coming with you," Clara said. He paused. "Clara." "He put my name in a legal letter," she said. "He made me part of this deliberately. I am not staying home." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "Get your coat," he said. Helen met them in the hall. She had been at breakfast and clearly heard enough to understand the shape of what was happening. She looked at Clara's face and Nathaniel's jaw, and the letter still in his hand. "What do you need?" she asked. It was directed at Clara. Clara looked at her. A week ago she would not have expected that question from Helen Castor. She was still slightly surprised by it now. "Stay here," Clara said. "If Marsh or anyone connected to him comes to this property while we're gone, don't let them inside, and send Pete for Tom immediately." "Done," Helen said. She said it the way women said things when they'd made a decision and didn't need to discuss it further. And Clara recognized the manner because she used it herself, and for one odd and genuine moment, she thought that Helen Castor was probably a great deal more than the woman she'd appeared to be on that first afternoon stepping out of a carriage. The ride to Willow Creek was the fastest Clara had made it. Nathaniel drove with the particular efficiency of a man on a mission, and the cold air was sharp enough to keep her completely present, which was what she needed. She thought about Edward Pruitt the whole way there. She thought about what Marsh's lawyer had written, and what it implied, and how a banker who didn't know her would read it. A civil judgment. An association with a woman of uncertain background. The suggestion never stated directly that Nathaniel Carter's judgment might be compromised. She thought about every time someone had looked at her and decided what she was before she could speak. She decided she was going to speak first today. First Territorial Bank sat on the main street of Willow Creek with the solid self-assurance of an institution that understood its own importance to a frontier town. Nathaniel tied the horse and opened the bank door, and Clara walked through it without slowing. Edward Pruitt was a compact man in his 50s with sharp eyes behind spectacles and the careful manner of someone who had made his career by being precise. He came out of his office when Nathaniel's name was given to the clerk, and his face when he saw Nathaniel was the face of a man who had been expecting this visit. "Nathaniel," he said, "I received a letter this morning." "I know," Nathaniel said. "This is Clara Whitmore. She manages my household. I'd like us to speak in your office." Pruitt looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him with the same directness she'd used on the courtroom judge 3 years ago, the difference being that this time she had documents. In Pruitt's office, she laid them out on his desk before anyone had said anything else. The lease, the clerk's letters, the timeline she'd reconstructed over the past 4 days that showed the sequence of Marsh's manipulation of the original contract dispute. She put each piece down in order, dated and referenced, and when she was done, she looked at Edward Pruitt and said, "The judgment on record against me was the result of a fraudulent contract dispute by the same man who has now sent you a letter implying I'm a liability. I would like you to read what I've just put in front of you, and then tell me what you see." Pruitt looked at the documents. He was quiet for a long time. He read carefully. She could tell he was actually reading, not skimming his eyes, moving with the methodical attention of someone whose profession required understanding what documents actually said rather than what they appeared to say at a glance. When he looked up, his expression had changed. "This survey reclassification," he said. "How long after the original lease was this filed?" 14 weeks, Clara said. "After the second drought period. Timed specifically to the point when my cash reserves would have been lowest and my legal options most limited." Pruitt looked at Nathaniel. "She worked this out herself?" he asked. "In about 4 days," Nathaniel said. "With worse source material than what's on your desk." Pruitt took off his spectacles and cleaned them, which Clara had observed was what precise men did when they were processing something significant. "The letter I received this morning," Pruitt said. "It implies questions about the management of the Carter Ranch accounts." "There are no questions about the management of those accounts," Clara said. "I reorganized them 3 weeks ago, and they are in better order than they've been in 2 years. You are welcome to audit them at any time." Pruitt looked at her. "You're offering a voluntary audit," he said. "I'm inviting you to look at work I'm proud of," she said. "There's nothing in those books that doesn't bear examination." The silence in the office had a particular texture, the texture of a decision being formed. "Gerald Marsh," Pruitt said carefully, "has been making inquiries at this bank for the past 6 months, regarding various properties, regarding notes and debts and financial situations of several families in this county." He put his spectacles back on. "I have found his methods during those inquiries to be aggressive." Clara did not look at Nathaniel. She kept her eyes on Pruitt. "Is that relevant to today's letter?" she asked. "It's relevant to my assessment of today's letter," Pruitt said. He looked at her documents one more time. He looked at Nathaniel. "My response to this morning's letter," he said, "will be that I have reviewed the relevant materials and find no basis for concern regarding the Carter Ranch accounts or their management." He straightened the papers she'd laid out. "I would suggest, however, that you acquire legal representation. Not because your position is weak. Because Marsh's method is attrition, and attrition is better countered with a lawyer than without one." "I know a lawyer in Bozeman," Nathaniel said. "He's good." "He's the right choice," Pruitt said. They stood. Pruitt came around the desk and shook Nathaniel's hand, and then, with only a slight pause, turned to Clara and extended his hand to her as well. She shook it. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "that was a well-organized presentation." "Thank you," she said. Outside on the street in the January cold, Nathaniel exhaled. Pruitt is going to write a response that makes Marsh's lawyer nervous, he said. Yes? Clara said. That buys us time. Time for the letter to Pete's father, she said, which is what we actually need. He turned to look at her in the particular sideways way he had, not full frontal. Not the straight-on look he used when he was being emphatic, but the angled look she'd come to understand meant he was thinking something he hadn't yet decided whether to say. What? She said. In that office, he said. You were practical, she said. I was going to say formidable, he said. Clara looked down the street of Willow Creek, the street where she had walked for 3 years as an invisible woman. The street where people had not stepped aside for her so much as looked through her, where she had carried pies to a general store and traded them for flour, and felt grateful for the transaction. She looked at it now with different eyes, not because she had changed, because something around her had. I was always formidable, she said. Nobody was paying attention. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. I'm paying attention now, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The cold moved between them, and neither of them moved against it, and something that had been building for 4 weeks sat in the air between them, without either of them reaching for it yet, which was not avoidance exactly, but something more like the respect two careful people paid to a thing that mattered too much to rush. We should get back, she said. Yes, he said, but neither of them moved for another moment. Then he untied the horse and she got into the buggy, and they drove back to the ranch, and the road was familiar now, in the way that places become familiar when you've traveled them enough times that they belong to you a little, and Clara thought about the word formidable, and what it felt like to have it said by a man who had watched her earn it in real time. It felt like something she had always known about herself being confirmed by someone who had been worth waiting for. Helen was at the front door when they pulled in. Her expression told Clara everything before she spoke. A man came, Helen said. An hour ago. He said he had documents for Nathaniel. I told him Nathaniel wasn't available. He said he'd leave them. She held out an envelope. He left this instead. He was smiling when he left. Clara looked at the envelope. She took it from Helen and opened it. It was not legal documents. It was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, and at the top it said, Miss Whitmore, I think we have some unfinished business, you and I. I wonder if Mr. Carter understands exactly what he's taken in. Perhaps it's time someone explained it to him. I look forward to our next conversation. GM. Clara read it twice. She folded it. She put it in her coat pocket. What does it say? Helen asked. It says he's running out of legitimate angles, Clara said, so he's trying a personal one. She went inside and hung up her coat and went to the kitchen and started the fire under the supper pot, because they had been out most of the day, and people needed to eat, and the doing of ordinary things when extraordinary pressure was building was something she had learned was not avoidance, but maintenance. Keeping the practical world running while the other world did its worst. Nathaniel came to the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later. Helen told me about the letter, he said. I know, Clara said. Can I see it? She took it from her coat pocket, which she'd hung by the door, and handed it to him. He read it. His jaw tightened. He's threatening to tell me something about you, Nathaniel said. Something he thinks I don't know. Yes, Clara said. Is there something he knows about you that I don't? Clara turned from the stove and looked at him. He knows that I was evicted from the mill 3 months before I met you, she said. The town did it officially, said the structure was a public hazard, and ordered it cleared. I didn't go. I stayed. The sheriff came twice, and I told him I had nowhere to go, and he looked at me and left both times without forcing it. She paused. Technically, I was in violation of a town ordinance for the last 3 months I was there. Marsh knows. He'll try to make it sound like a criminal record. Nathaniel looked at her. That's what he has, he asked. That's what he has, she said. He put the letter on the counter. A widow evicted from an abandoned building she was using for survival, he said, because she had nowhere else to go, and a town that looked the other way because even they couldn't fully justify it. He looked at her steadily. That's his leverage. When he presents it, it won't sound like that, she said. It will sound like whatever I let it sound like, Nathaniel said. And I'm not going to let it sound like anything, because what it is shameful to the people who allowed it, and I have no intention of treating it as anything else. Clara looked at him, the man who had crossed his kitchen and put his hand near hers on the edge of the desk, the man who had taken her documents to a land office and a bank and a horse barn where a 19-year-old might have a father who could save her past. The man who had knocked on the door of an abandoned mill in January cold, because he could not explain why a pie mattered, and had been honest enough about that inexplicability to follow it anyway. She had not let herself fully feel it until this moment. She felt it now. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." She did not say what she'd been about to say. She looked at him for a moment and changed it. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Marsh hasn't finished." "No," she agreed, "but I have." He tilted his head slightly. "Being afraid of him," she said. "I've been afraid of him since the day he walked out of that courtroom. I kept thinking he was bigger than me. He's not. He's just been working alone longer, and he got used to winning." She looked at the letter on the counter. "He's not used to someone fighting back." Nathaniel picked up the letter. He folded it and put it in his own pocket. "Let's show him what that looks like," he said. The letter from Robert Calloway arrived on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Pete had written to Denver. Clara was in the kitchen when Pete came through the back door at a near run, which was not something Pete Calloway did without reason. He was holding the envelope like it was something that might break, and his face had the particular expression of a young man who understood that what he was carrying mattered more than he fully knew. "It came," he said. "Miss Clara, it came." She wiped her hands and took the envelope from him and did not open it right away. She stood holding it and breathed once deliberately, the way her mother had taught her to breathe, before something important not to calm down Ruth had said, but to be fully present for whatever was coming. Then she opened it. Robert Calloway wrote the way men wrote who had not done much writing but understood when the truth needed to be on paper. His sentences were short and direct and completely without decoration. He wrote that he remembered the property on the South Lease Road. He wrote that he had been there in March of 1880 on an errand for a neighboring farmer and had seen Gerald Marsh walking the boundary line of the Whitmore lease with a man carrying surveying equipment on a date that was 6 days before the breach notice was filed and 14 days before the official survey reclassification was recorded. He wrote that he had not understood at the time what he was seeing. He wrote that he understood it now. He wrote that he would come to Willow Creek to say so in person if it was needed. He wrote that he was sorry he hadn't said something sooner. Clara read it twice. She folded it very carefully along its original creases. She looked at Pete, who was watching her face with the focused attention of someone who had not been told what the stakes were, but had figured out they were high. "Your father," she said, "is a good man." Pete straightened in the particular way young men straightened when something they cared about was confirmed. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "He is." She sent Pete to find Nathaniel. Nathaniel read the letter at the kitchen table and was very still while he read it, and very still for a moment after. Then he looked up, and his eyes had something in them that she did not often see there. Something that looked like relief, but ran deeper than relief, more like the particular feeling of watching justice become possible after a long time of watching it remain out of reach. "This is enough for a lawyer to work with," he said. "It's more than enough," Clara said. "A witness who places Marsh on that property with surveying equipment before the official survey was filed. It means the breach trigger was manufactured. It means the judgment against me was obtained through fraud." Nathaniel set the letter down. "We need to get this to Samuel Greer in Bozeman today," he said. Greer was the lawyer he'd mentioned to Pruitt, the one he'd worked with before and trusted. "I'll ride out this afternoon." "I'm coming," Clara said. He did not argue. Helen came into the kitchen while they were preparing to leave and read the situation accurately without being told anything. "Go," she said. "I'll manage things here." Clara looked at her. In the weeks since Helen had arrived, planning to dismantle everything, and instead stayed to help hold it together, something real had grown between them. Not the easy warmth of people who were naturally similar. Something harder and more durable than that, the respect of two women who had assessed each other honestly and found the assessment worth keeping. "Lock the front door," Clara said. "If Marsh sends anyone—" "I was managing difficult men before you were born, Clara Whitmore," Helen said, not unkindly. "Go." They went. Samuel Greer was a thin man in his 60s, with a reputation in Bozeman for being the lawyer that other lawyers did not want to face across a courtroom. He had the eyes of someone who had spent 40 years reading documents that people hoped he would misread, and he had never developed the habit of obliging them. Nathaniel had used him twice before in boundary disputes, and both times Greer had won not through theatrics, but through the particular grinding thoroughness of a man who left no stone unexamined. He read Robert Calloway's letter in his office without comment. Then he read the other documents Clara had brought: the lease, the clerk's correspondence, the timeline she had reconstructed, and he was quiet for a long time. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, "how long have you had these documents?" "The lease and the clerk's letters since the original case," Clara said. "I've had them 3 years." "And no one looked at them?" "I had no one to look at them," she said. "I was alone." Greer looked at Nathaniel. "You understand what this represents?" Greer said. It was not a question. "Tell me anyway," Nathaniel said. "This represents a deliberate, documented pattern of fraud against an individual for the purpose of obtaining property through manufactured legal default," Greer said in the flat, precise tone of a man reading from a mental ledger. "With Calloway's testimony, we can demonstrate that the survey reclassification was pre-planned before any breach was alleged. That makes the judgment against Miss Whitmore not merely erroneous, but fraudulent. It can be vacated. The property, if it hasn't been sold on to a third party." "He sold it inside 6 months," Clara said. Greer nodded. "Then we pursue damages rather than property recovery. And separately," he set down the papers. "Separately, we have enough here to refer the broader pattern to the Territorial Attorney General, the Hendersons, the other 2 families you mentioned. This is not one fraudulent transaction. This is a method applied repeatedly against people he calculated couldn't fight back." Clara said nothing. She was looking at the papers on Greer's desk and thinking about the courtroom 3 years ago, where she had sat alone and watched a judge look at her with boredom and sign a document that took everything she had built. She was thinking about the mill, about the cold inside those walls, about the morning she had made a pie because she needed to remember what hope felt like. She was thinking about a man in a general store who had taken one bite and gone completely, utterly still. "How long?" Nathaniel asked. "To file the motion to vacate the judgment." "I can have the initial filing ready in 2 weeks, Greer said. "Calloway's testimony will need to be formalized, either deposition here in Bozeman or in person at a hearing. That depends on what the court requires." He looked at Clara. "This will take time, and Marsh will fight it. He will hire lawyers and delay and make it as expensive and exhausting as he can, because that is what men like this do when they realize they've miscalculated." "Let him," Clara said. Greer looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had met very few people he was genuinely interested in and had just identified one. "Yes," he said, "let him." They rode back to Willow Creek in the early dark. The February cold harder now with the sun gone, and Clara sat beside Nathaniel in the buggy and felt something in her chest that she had not felt since Missouri. Not happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for something this layered. More like solidity. The feeling of standing on ground that would hold. "Greer will win it," Nathaniel said. "I know," she said. "It might take a year." "I know that too." He looked at the road ahead. "You're not afraid of that," he said. "I was afraid for 3 years," she said. "I've used up my supply." He said nothing for a moment. "Clara," he said. The way he said her name had changed over the past weeks. She had noticed it happening gradually, the way gradual things happened, without announcement, without a single definable moment of change, just a slow shift in quality that you looked up one day and realized had become something different from what it started as. It had moved from the name of an employee to the name of someone he was used to carrying with him. Something that had become necessary in the way that necessary things became necessary, quietly, practically permanently. "Yes," she said. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that whatever your answer is, nothing changes about your position at the ranch. Your work, your room, your wages. None of that is contingent on what you say." She turned to look at him. He was still watching the road with the careful attention of a man who was managing something he didn't want to mismanage. "I'm listening," she said. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as the housekeeper." The cold moved around them. The horse's breath made clouds in the dark air. "Nathaniel," she said, "I'm not asking you to decide tonight," he said. "I'm not asking you to say anything right now. I want you to know that it's what I'm asking." He paused. Elizabeth was... He stopped. Started again. "Elizabeth was the person who taught me that a house is not a building. She used to say it was the person inside it who made it mean something. And for 2 years, I've been living in a building." His voice was controlled the way it was always controlled over the things that mattered most, but she could hear what was underneath it. "You made it a house again, not by replacing anything, not by being anything other than exactly who you are. And who you are is..." He stopped again. She waited. "Extraordinary," he said. "That's the word. I know it sounds true," she said quietly. He looked at her, then the full straight-on look. "I've been alone a long time," Clara said. "I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because I want you to understand that I know the difference between someone offering me something because they feel sorry for me and someone offering me something because they mean it." She held his gaze. "I know the difference, Nathaniel. I mean it," he said. "I know," she said. The horse moved through the dark, and the cold settled around them, and she thought about what it felt like to be known. Not observed, not assessed. Known, the specific, valuable, irreplaceable feeling of having someone see the actual you, the one that existed beneath the layers that other people's opinions built up like sediment over years, and find that version worth choosing. "Ask me again in the spring," she said, "when the ground thaws and things look different. If you still mean it in the spring, ask me again." He looked at her. "I'll still mean it," he said. "I know," she said, "but ask me anyway." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shape that lived just under one, the warmth before warmth fully surfaced. "All right," he said. "In the spring." They drove the rest of the way home in silence, but it was a different silence than any they had sat in before. It had a future in it. That was the only way she could name it. It was a silence with a future, and that was something she had not had for a very long time. Gerald Marsh made his final move 2 weeks later. He did not do it himself. Men like Marsh rarely did the final things themselves. They sent instruments people who moved on their behalf and could be disavowed if the movement failed. He sent a man named Colton to the Carter Ranch on a Saturday afternoon when he had calculated correctly, as it turned out, that Nathaniel would be away at the North Pasture dealing with a fence break that Tom Briggs had reported that morning. Clara had not left for town. She had stayed at the ranch because something in the morning had felt wrong. A particular quality of too convenient that she had learned to pay attention to after 3 years of managing survival in small margins. When Colton arrived, he came with 2 men behind him and a folder of papers and an expression that had been manufactured to suggest authority it did not actually possess. He knocked on the front door. Clara opened it. He looked at her with the specific look of a man who had expected someone else. "I'm looking for Nathaniel Carter," he said. "He's not available," Clara said. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I manage this household. Whatever you've come to deliver, you can deliver it to me." Colton looked at the 2 men behind him. He looked back at Clara. He had not prepared for this. "I have documents requiring Mr. Carter's signature," he said. "Legal documents. They pertain to the fraudulent transfer of a debt instrument." "The Henderson note," Clara said. Colton blinked. "Those allegations," Clara said, "have been referred to Samuel Greer of Bozeman, who is Mr. Carter's legal counsel. All correspondence regarding them goes through Mr. Greer's office. I can give you his address if Mr. Marsh's people don't already have it." She looked at Colton steadily. "They should have it by now. He filed the motion to vacate the judgment against me 6 days ago." Colton's expression shifted. He had not known about the motion. Clara watched him not know about it and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. The ground had shifted, and he could feel it shifting, and the best thing she could do was stand in the doorway and let him feel it fully. "There are also questions," Colton said, recovering. "About your personal history, Miss Whitmore. Questions that are relevant to what exactly?" Helen Castor said. She had appeared in the hallway behind. Clara had been there. Clara suspected since she'd heard the knock, because Helen Castor was a woman who positioned herself strategically without making it look like positioning. Colton looked at Helen. "And you are?" he said. "Helen Castor," Helen said. "Elizabeth Carter's sister. I've been staying here for the past several weeks." She came to stand beside Clara in the doorway. "I'm very interested in what questions you think are relevant about Miss Whitmore, since I have had the opportunity to observe her work closely during that time, and I find your insinuations, whatever they are, to be not only incorrect, but frankly offensive." She tilted her head slightly. "Would you like me to write that down for Mr. Marsh, or will you remember it?" Behind Colton, one of the two men shifted his weight. Tom Briggs was crossing the yard from the barn. He had not been sent for. He had simply seen what was happening, and come the way Tom Briggs moved to things that needed managing, with the unhurried certainty of a man who knew his own competence. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked at Colton and his companions with the flat assessment Clara had seen on his face the first morning she'd met him. "These men leaving," Tom said. It was directed at Clara, but his eyes were on Colton. "They are," Clara said. Tom nodded and stood where he was, and Pete came around the corner of the barn and stopped there without being asked, and Sam Litch appeared from somewhere behind the outbuilding and leaned against the fence and watched. Colton looked at the folder in his hands. He looked at Clara. He looked at Helen. He looked at Tom Briggs. He made a calculation. He made the right one. "Mr. Carter will be hearing from Mr. Marsh's attorney," he said. "Mr. Carter's attorney will be waiting," Clara said. Colton left. His two men left behind him. Nobody on the porch moved until the sound of their horses had faded down the road. Then Tom Briggs looked up at Clara and said with the minimal expressiveness of a man who had made a thorough peace with her existence over the past month and a half. "Good." He turned and went back to the barn. Pete was grinning from ear to ear. Clara turned and looked at Helen. Helen was smoothing her jacket with both hands, which was what Helen did when she was managing feelings she didn't want to display. "That," Helen said, "was very satisfying." "Yes," Clara said, "it was." She went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and let the adrenaline work through her slowly the way it needed to work through. And she thought about the morning 3 years ago when she had stood in front of a judge and had no Tom Briggs, no Helen Castor, no Pete around the corner, no Samuel Greer with a motion already filed, no Nathaniel Carter waiting at the north pasture to come home and be told what she had done. She had been entirely alone that morning. She was not alone now. She thought about what that meant, what it cost, what it asked of her in return, and she decided it asked her to be exactly who she was without apology or diminishment, and that was something she already knew how to do. She had been doing it in an abandoned mill for 3 years. She could do it here. Nathaniel came back at dusk. Helen told him. Clara listened from the kitchen to Helen's account of the afternoon, which was accurate and precise, and delivered with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had enjoyed herself and was not going to pretend otherwise. She heard Nathaniel go quiet in the way he went quiet when something significant had happened, and he was incorporating it. He came to the kitchen doorway. She was making supper. He looked at her for a moment. "Helen says you stood in the door for 20 minutes, he said. "About that," Clara said. "She says Helen was there too." "She appeared," Clara said. "I did not ask her. She made her own decision. She told me what she said to them." "It was a good speech," Clara said. "She has a gift for it." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. She turned from the stove and looked at him and thought about the honest answer to that question. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right. I'm actually all right," which is different from saying it because it's what you're supposed to say. She looked at him steadily. "I was not afraid of them today. I was not afraid at the bank. I have not been afraid since the night we sat in this study, and I made the decision to stop being afraid." She paused. "I don't know exactly when you did that, made that possible, but you did." He came fully into the kitchen. He did not stop at the table. He came to where she was standing at the stove, and he stood close enough that she was fully aware of him. The same proximity she had noticed in the study weeks ago that she had carefully not acted on because the time had not been right. The time had not been right then. Something in the air told her it was right now. "Spring is 8 weeks away," he said. "I know," she said. "I told you I'd ask again in the spring." "You did. I find," he said quietly, and without any particular performance, "that I'm having difficulty waiting 8 weeks." She looked up at him. His face was the face she had been reading for nearly 2 months, the controlled exterior, and the genuine, undefended thing that ran underneath it, the thing Elizabeth Carter had spent years teaching him not to hide. He was not hiding it now. "Then don't wait," she said. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with urgency. Just carefully, the way you held something you intended to keep his broad, rough hand around hers, and the warmth of it, after all the cold of everything that had preceded it, was something she felt in her entire chest. "Stay," he said. "Not as the housekeeper. Not as someone I rescued or employed or brought in from the cold. As the person I want beside me, for everything that comes next." He looked at her directly, the full, straight-on look that meant he had made a decision and meant it completely. "I know it hasn't been long. I know that's a reasonable objection. I also know that some things don't require time to be true. This is one of them." Clara looked at him. She thought about her mother, who had told her that the size of a woman's heart mattered more than the size of her body. She thought about 3 years in a mill, and the cold, and the particular loneliness of being invisible in a place full of people. She thought about the morning she had made a pie, not because she had a plan, but because she needed to remember what hope felt like. She thought about a man who had knocked on every door in town in January cold, because he couldn't explain why something mattered, and had been honest enough about that inexplicability to follow it all the way to a broken-down mill at the edge of everything. "Yes," she said. Simple, certain, complete. He held her hand, and she let herself be held, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and outside the Montana cold was doing its business against the walls of the house, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and they were both people who understood the difference between silence that was empty and silence that was full. The months that followed moved the way months move when life has finally organized itself around something true, not without difficulty, not without the ongoing friction of real things being built in a real world, but with a direction to it, a forward motion that felt earned. Samuel Greer vacated the judgment against Clara in April. He did it in a Bozeman courtroom on a Tuesday morning with Robert Calloway, sitting in the gallery, having made the trip from Denver at his own expense, because Pete had written him a second letter explaining now what it was actually about. Robert Calloway was a compact, weathered man who looked like an older version of his son, and when the judge read the motion and looked at Calloway's affidavit, and then looked at the original documents, with the expression of a man who was understanding, too slowly, how thoroughly he had been manipulated. In the original proceeding, Robert Calloway met his gaze without flinching, and said clearly, and for the record, what he had seen on that boundary road in March of 1880. The judgment was vacated. The record was corrected. 3 months later, the Territorial Attorney General opened an inquiry into Gerald Marsh's business practices, based in part on a referral from Samuel Greer, and in part on a complaint filed by Edward Pruitt of First Territorial Bank, who had, in the months since Clara had laid her documents on his desk, been doing his own methodical examination of Marsh's various inquiries, and found a pattern he considered it his professional obligation to report. Gerald Marsh, who had built his business on finding people without backing and applying pressure until they broke, discovered that the pressure he had applied to the Carter Ranch had not broken anyone. He discovered that the woman he had beaten in a courtroom 3 years ago had not stayed beaten. He discovered that miscalculating the strength of a person because she was a large woman alone in an abandoned mill was the kind of error that did not stop having consequences after the original moment had passed. He left Willow Creek in the summer. Nobody was sorry. Dale Henderson told the story of that departure to anyone who came into his store for the following month, with increasing embellishment and increasing satisfaction. And Clara heard 3 different versions of it, and found all 3 of them accurate in the ways that mattered. Nathaniel asked her to marry him in May, standing in the yard in the first real warmth of spring, with the mud still on his boots from the morning rounds, not having planned the moment with any particular care, which was exactly right, because Clara would not have trusted a carefully planned moment from a man who expressed the things that mattered to him plainly and directly and without theater. She said yes in the same plain and direct way. Helen cried, which she denied afterward, and which everyone who witnessed it agreed had happened, and said nothing about because Helen Castor had earned the right to cry at whatever moved her. Pete Calloway stood at the barn door and said to no one in particular that he reckoned he'd seen that coming about 2 weeks after Clara arrived, which Tom Briggs agreed with, and which made Pete insufferably satisfied for approximately 3 days. They fixed up the old mill that summer, not because anyone was sentimental about it, or not only because of that, because it was a good stone building on a good piece of land by a river, and because Clara looked at it and thought about what Elizabeth Carter had written in her notebook about the bakery she'd always wanted, and thought about the note that had lived inside the recipe box in the cellar about things that started not having to stop just because the person who started them was gone. She said to Nathaniel one evening when they were walking the property and the mill came into view with the summer light on its stone walls, "I'd like to do something with that building." He looked at it. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. She told him. He listened. He said, "Then let's do it." The bakery opened in October. It was not a large bakery. It was not a fine one by the standards of places that had the luxury of caring about such distinctions. It was a bakery in a reclaimed stone mill on the edge of Willow Creek, run by a woman who had spent 3 years inside those walls, learning the particular lesson that life teaches people it cannot break any other way. That what you are is not diminished by what happens to you. That the size of a person's value has nothing to do with the size of their body, or the size of their bank account, or the size of the space they occupy, in a world that has not yet figured out how to see them. People came from 3 counties, ostensibly for the pies. Actually for something they couldn't quite name, a quality in the place, in the woman who ran it, in the particular atmosphere of a space that had been built by someone who understood what it felt like to need a door that opened toward you. Clara made Elizabeth's recipe, and she made her mother's recipe, and she made things she invented herself from what was available and what felt right, and she kept a table near the window where people who came alone could sit as long as they needed to without being asked to move along, because she knew what it was to need a place where no one asked you to be smaller than you were. Nathaniel came by every afternoon when he could, not to check on anything, not because the bakery needed managing, because this was where his wife was, and this was where his wife had built the thing she was meant to build. And he had learned from a woman with round, clear handwriting in a notebook in a cellar that some people took years to know, and some people you knew almost immediately. And the second kind were the kind worth following into an abandoned mill in January, cold on no better evidence than a bite of pie that tasted like something real. He sat at the counter, and she brought him coffee without being asked, because she had been doing it since the second morning in his kitchen, and she suspected she would be doing it until she was very old, and neither of them considered this routine to be anything less than what it was. A small act of knowing someone repeated daily, which was what love looked like when it had been alive long enough to become part of the structure of ordinary life. The woman who had been invisible to every person in Willow Creek for 3 years became the person everyone knew. Not because she changed, because the world finally caught up to who she had always been. And in a stone building by the river, in the town, that had once looked through her like she wasn't there. Clara Whitmore. Carter made pies and kept the door open and let anyone in who needed a place to be seen. That was what home had always meant to her. That was what it meant now. That was what it would keep meaning in the way that true things kept being true, regardless of what the world decided to do about them. She had always known her own worth. She had simply been waiting for the world to catch up. It did. And it was about time.